the evolution of Paris as the capital of the Western art in the 19th and the 20th century has its beginnings in the 17th century, when the arts were still the domain of the court and the educated nobility. The powerful and centralized French monarchy, Louis XIV in particular, pursued a policy of encouraging and controlling the arts. Catholic France had never turned its back on Rome, and the monarchy was able to incorporate elements of classical and Renaissance tradition into a program to train, employ, and reward artists. The Lutheran and Calvinist countries of Northern Europe were often as military powerful as France, but the Reformation had isolated them from immediate access to Italy. It was not politically possible for their rulers to use the classical tradition as a carrier for a coherent policy in the arts, and none of them developed such a national policy. In 1648, Louis XIV established the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture and the school for teaching art that opened in the Louvre. The king paid for the annual exhibitions where academicians showed their works. Artists were raised above the status of artisans and became men of learning and teachers of the principles of beauty and taste. There were no women, of course. Academy members defined the correct style of painting strictly founded on the imitation of Greek and Roman and high Renaissance art. They passed these ideas on to their students through a fixed program of rigorous academic training. During the Revolution, the Royal Academy was suppressed, but new institutions were soon created to continue the marriage of art and politics. By 1860, the state-supported structure was firmly in place. The newly formed Institut de France was the new guardian of French language and culture, and the Académie des Beaux-Arts was one of its sections. The artist members of the new academy were in charge of the official art school, the École des Beaux-Arts, and the Académie de France at Villa Medici in Rome. They judged the competition for the Prix de Rome and chose the jurors for the annual salons in Paris. These maîtres also opened their studios to students or taught at the commercial academies that followed the same form of drawing from the model as at the École, and held the same endless rounds of competitions that assured homogeneity and excluded originality and innovation. In 1791, the salons opened to foreign artists. Foreign students could also enroll at the École des Beaux-Arts, although they could never compete for the Prix de Rome. They could win medals in the salons and have their work purchased by the French government. Those artists who returned to their home countries sent new generations of art students to Paris to study, exhibit at the salons, and sell their works in the Paris market. This, quote, French art machine kept art in France under an iron hand and promoted it at the same time. The number of artists in Paris grew rapidly, and I estimate that by 1860, 6,000 painters and sculptors, French and foreign, lived and worked in Paris. As we all know, the machine began to fall apart during the last part of the 19th century, but the momentum it had created drew new generations of artists and art students to Paris well into the first half of the 20th century. And this strong history continues to provide the rationale for the aggressive French art policy that we see today. The lights, please. Slide 1. Before the revolution, when the Louvre was the center of the artistic activity, the Grand Salon was used for the annual exhibitions, which came to be called salons. Artists working on commissions for the crown were given studios and apartments within the Louvre itself. But to make room for all the paintings and sculpture he had collected from his successful campaigns in Italy, Napoleon began to clear the Louvre of the artists. This expulsion was completed in 1806 and signaled a new era in the social environment of artists in Paris. Artists spread out to both sides of the Seine, and substantial artist communities grew up in the two areas of the city, Montmartre and Montparnasse. Montmartre and the neighboring Batignolles area is better known today than Montparnasse because it was the home of the Impressionists. The first artists settled in the area at the foot of the hill below Boulevard Clichy. The toll barrier the wall ran along this boulevard. Outside the wall, higher up the hill, tax-free taverns, guignettes, cabarets flourished with accompanying bootlegging, prostitution, and petty crimes. This raucous life permeated the character of the Montmartre community even after the walls were abolished. Montparnasse, as we shall see, had a very different character. Next slide. The name of the area comes from a hill in the open country south of the Château monastery. Here it is on a map from 1672. You see the hill, of course. It was still surrounded by open fields with duelers, farmers, shepherds, and windmills. The hill got its name, Montparnasse, from the generations of students from the Sorbonne who gathered there to declaim their poetry. The road north of the hill became Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs, which is still wiggling the same way it is. And at the far left are Rue de Vaugirard, and at the far right, Rue Saint-Jacques. In 1702, Louis XIV ordered construction of the southern section of the Grand Boulevard. Work began on Boulevard Montparnasse, which was drawn directly through the hill, as we see in this map from 1714. However, it took until 1760 to complete the boulevard and erase the hill. Hunting lodges and summer residences were built north of the boulevard by wealthy residents from what is now the 7th arrondissement. Next slide. In the map to the right, no, that's to left for you, right? Boulevard Raspail has been completed south of Boulevard Montparnasse and projected further north. The hill was located exactly at the intersection of these two boulevards, right here in the middle. And Boulevard Raspail was called the Boulevard d'Enfer at the time. The artists who began to move into this area early in the 19th century were attracted by the tranquility and open space. Artists made studios from storage sheds, summer cottages, artisans' workshops, fencing halls, and abandoned stables. During the building boom in the 1880s, real estate speculators began to build artist studios. On the right is a map of the distribution of these studios, which two students at the Sorbonne made in 1982. This is supposed to indicate the Boulevard Montparnasse with the studio concentration, and this is Boulevard Clichy below it, and these are studios up the hill, and this is the Batignolles area where the very wealthy artists live. Next. Because of the basic orientation of Paris streets in the east-west direction, it was easy to build studios with windows that provided the artist with a maximum of northern diffused light. These studio buildings were regularly built in deep courtyards behind the conventional apartment buildings. They were primitive, rudimentary structures, sometimes built with leftover material from the World's Fairs. In some cases, many studios would be clustered in one large building, like the one at 9 Rue Campan-Premier, shown here on the left slide. It was built with material from the 1889 World Exposition. It still stands today and houses about 50 studios. Characteristic studio architecture developed, which I think this room shows. As we see on the right, it consisted of one large room with tall ceiling, large vertical windows, or a skylight. Inside the room, along the wall facing the windows, ran a balcony, which was used for sleeping or viewing the paintings at a distance. Next slide. This is a perfect example of this room. Montparnasse was the home of wealthy academic artists, in particular sculptors, who needed flat ground and large spaces for their monumental works. To the left is Bartholdi's studio, which was located at what is now the intersection of Rue Vavin and Boulevard Raspail. Maîtres like Gérôme, Carolus Durand, and Bouguereau built luxurious private houses which contained living quarters and elaborate studios. The slide to the right shows the studio on the top floor of the building Bouguereau constructed on Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs. Behind him is a large glass-enclosed painting studio. Next. To prepare for the entrance exams at the École des Beaux-Arts and to supplement the rigid training there, many art students attended private ateliers or commercial art academies. The largest and most famous commercial academy was Académie Julian, which was opened by a painter, Rudolphe Julien, in 1868. It offered 2 sessions of drawing from the model each day. Famous academic painters who also taught at the école, like Bouguereau and Robert de Fleury, came to make the corrections. The academy charged a low monthly fee and admitted students of any age and nationality. By the end of the century, Académie Julian had more than 600 students at several locations around Paris. It also opened studios reserved for women who were not accepted at the École des Beaux-Arts or allowed in classes with a like model. On the left, Bouguereau sits with his class at Académie Julian. He is said to have been so successful that he said that I lose 100 francs every time I go out to pee. More than these free academies began to appear in Montparnasse. The Académie Vitae opened on Boulevard Montparnasse for women only. Here, the American sculptor Frederick McManus corrects students' work in his atelier there. In 1870, next slide please. In 1870, the Académie Suisse, which had been started in 1815, was taken over by a former model, Colarossi, and moved under his name to the courtyard at 10 Rue de la Grande Chaumière. It is shown here on the left. The Académie de la Grande Chaumière, next door to Colarossi at number 14, was started in 1906 by Castelluccio, the artist brother of the paint dealer, whose shop was down on the same street. The paint dealers were an important ingredient in the art community. One of the largest was Lefebvre-Fournet on the Rue Brea. They sold art supplies and answered technical questions. Also, they would store and ship paintings and represent artists at the Salon when they were away from Paris. Lefebvre-Fournet would routinely extend credit and take paintings as payment. Although Madame Lefebvre-Fournet added this note of warning about Léger in her account book: not too much credit, too modern. The academic painters needed a variety of models to portray the Greek goddesses, Roman warriors, saints, and Madonnas that were the subjects of their paintings, and the academies needed models for their classes. To fill this need, a model market of entire families of Italians gathered every Monday morning on Boulevard Montparnasse, spilling down Rue de la Grande Chaumière. The artists or the class monitors from the academies would come to select the models for the week. In the right slide are some of the Italian models standing outside Académie de la Grande Chaumière. Next slide. American art students who began to come to Paris in large numbers after the Civil War settled in Montparnasse rather than Montmartre. By 1890, the largest number of foreign artists were Americans. One American artist, Colonel A. Anderson, who had come to Paris in the mid-80s, founded the all-male American Art Association in an abandoned school building in the garden at 131 Boulevard du Montparnasse. The club, as it was soon called, was to provide a home so that the young students, quote, would not drift into the most unfortunate associations. The drawing to the left shows the genteel pleasures of the club library, the reception room, the garden, the restaurants which served meals for 1 franc, but prohibited liquor, gambling, or discussions of politics. Despite the obstacles women faced, more than a third of the Americans who showed in the salons were women. Enid Jandel arrived in Paris in 1895 and studied with McManus at Académie Vitae. Like many Americans who worked in Paris, she had many commissions from the United States. Here she stands in a Paris studio with Pallas Athena for the full-sized replica of the Parthenon, built in Nashville to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Tennessee's statehood. Next slide. Café life, as it had developed with Impressionists in Montmartre, began slowly in Montparnasse. Students had rigorous and time-consuming schedules of study. The academic artists were too sure of their aesthetic positions and too busy fulfilling commissions to indulge in frivolous discussions in cafes. The first signs of cafe life appeared in the late 1890s when Scandinavian artists moving from Montmartre discovered an old cafe, the Café Versailles, on Place de Rennes, in front of the Gare du Montparnasse. It is over in the center here. The Norwegian painters Christian Krogh and Edward Diericks held court here, along with some symbolist poets, American Stuart Merrill and the Frenchman Paul Fort, and the young Apollinaire, who joined them in 1903. At the other end of Boulevard Montparnasse was Closerie de Lille, which had been a small two-story guignette or way station selling and serving wine. A new building was built in 1902, and in 1903 the new Closerie de Lille opened. The cafe is located to the right in the slide, and the street is Boulevard Montparnasse looking west. Next slide. When Closerie de Lille reopened, Paul Fort established his headquarters there and organized Tuesday evening poetry readings. For a decade, he presided over a lively mix of poets, painters, and writers, French and foreign. To the left, Paul Fort sits in front of stacks of copies of his literary magazine, Vers et Prose. Apollinaire joined Paul Fort at the readings in May 1903 and recorded his impressions in his diary of those years, which has just been published. And later Picasso, who lived at Plateau Lavoir in Montmartre, would walk across town to the readings with his mistress, Fernande Olivier. Next slide. In 1902, construction began on the section of Boulevard Raspail north of Boulevard Montparnasse, shown here in the left slide. When Boulevard Raspail finally opened in 1906, the focus of café life in Montparnasse shifted to Carrefour Vavin. A small bar, the Rotonde, opened in a building to the right in the slide. Here. To the left, across Boulevard Montparnasse, is the Dôme, which opened in 1898. Both cafes were filled with workers and coachmen from the large tramway depot on Rue de Londres. Next slide. At the Dôme, the coachmen were joined by American artists who took over the billiard tables in the back room. Beginning about 1903, with the arrival of Rudolf Levy and other Munich artists, the front room was taken over by German and Scandinavian artists, as seen in the photo to the left. The photo was taken in February 1910. Meanwhile, the Rotonde across the street was bought by the enterprising Victor Libion, who was the first in a long line of café owners who specifically encouraged the artist clientele by letting them sit for hours over one café crème. Libion's open and generous personality created an incredible mix of nationalities and personalities never seen before. Over the next years, artists like Modigliani, Matisse, Picasso, Soutine, Lipschitz, Brancusi, Diego de Rivera, Mondrian, Chagall, and so on, gathered in what Marcel Duchamp described as the first truly international art community we ever had. I want to mention here that it was also a conscious decision of the French government to let Montparnasse develop as an artist quarter. The police considered it a free zone and permitted more eccentric behavior here than would have been tolerated in other areas of Paris. The prostitution and petty crimes that plagued Montmartre, the Montmartre area, was not permitted in Montparnasse. About 1/3 of the total artist population of Paris lived in Montparnasse, but they represented less than 1% of the population of the area. However, they were able to live and work undisturbed, and their lives and personalities shaped the social life of the quarter. Next. In the early part of the 20th century, artists who came to Paris began to stay and make it their home. Individual personalities begin to stand out in the history of Montparnasse. One of the first of these was Jules Pasquin. He arrived in Paris on Christmas Day in 1905 from Bulgaria via Munich, where he had been making drawings for the German satirical magazine Simplicissimus. He immediately became the center of the group at the Dome, where he would sit and draw for hours. Here from the left is the dealer Villeneuve, artist Walter Bondy and Rudolf Levy, and Pasquin drawing. Pasquin fell in love with the eccentric, talented young artist Hermine David, shown to the right. Pasquin's reputation for seduction and debauchery was well known, and Hermine's mother sewed her into a corset for Hermine's first meeting with Pasquin, but to no avail. Next slide. One of the most famous long-time inhabitants of Montparnasse was Gertrude Stein, who joined her brother Leo in 1905 in a studio in the courtyard of 27 Rue Fleurus. They discovered Matisse at the Salon d'Automne in 1905, but Gertrude deserted him for Picasso. Her brother Michael and his wife Sarah became friends and supporters of Matisse. Here he sits at the dinner in their apartment on Rue Maldan. From left is Michael, Sarah, Matisse, and Alan Stein, and the German painter Hans Purman. Matisse paintings cover the walls behind them. Next slide. Sarah Stein, who had been studying informally with Matisse, convinced him to start an academy. Stein, together with Hans Purman, Swedish artist Carl Palme, and Americans Max Weber and Patrick Henry Bruce, made all the arrangements, and the academy opened in January 1908. Later that year, the academy found a permanent home in a former convent on Boulevard des Invalides. The academy became an immediate success, attracting German, Scandinavian, Russian, and American students, but only 2 Frenchmen. In the left slide, Matisse sits with his students. In the front row, in shirt sleeves, is the only Frenchman in the group, Pierre de Breuil. To the right, a group of Scandinavian artists in front of Café Versailles, which had become the headquarters for the new generation of Scandinavian artists at the Matisse Academy. Next slide. Per Krog's father, Christian, taught at the Académie Colarossi, and Per actually grew up in Montparnasse and went to French schools. He studied paintings with his father and later attended the Matisse Academy. Per met the beautiful Lucy Vidil when she was a model at Matisse's. Lucy was typical of the young women who escaped from repressive homes and were attracted to the artist community. Her mother had apprenticed her to a sausage maker, but she ran away and was living in Montparnasse, working as a seamstress, when a friend asked her to model at the Matisse Academy. To the left is Per at the Academy. In the background is the statue of Apollo that the students bought for the Academy. To the right is Lucy in the studio. Next slide. Modigliani arrived in Paris from Livorno in 1906 and settled first in Montmartre. The remarkable photo to the right is taken in the courtyard of 7 Rue du Delta in Montmartre, where Modigliani's patron, Dr. Paul Alexander, had established an artist colony. A young art student, André Varnot, remembers a Christmas party there in 1908. Quote, "They ordered a barrel of wine. There was a lot of food, and then the hashish. Modigliani was the grand host. Crazy things happened that night. The two Modigliani paintings on the ground miraculously survived. To the left is a head of a woman, and to the right, mournful nude. In 1909, Modigliani moved to Montparnasse, where he began to carve stone heads." Next. Around 1910, artists began to arrive in large numbers from Eastern Europe. Refugees from prejudice and oppression, they had no intention of returning to their native countries, but made Montparnasse their new home. One painter, whose generous and exuberant personality made him one of the axes around which Montparnasse life revolved, was Moishe Kiesling. He arrived from Poland in 1910. His most famous early exploit was a duel with the Polish painter Leopold Gottlieb. The duel was held on June 12, 1914, at Parc des Princes near Port St. Cloud, and was covered by the newspapers and newsreel cameras. Fujita, son of a samurai family, studied at the School of Western Art in Tokyo with a painter who had been in Paris. He left Tokyo in 1913. On the right, Fujita on the Mishima Maru, 2 days from Marseille. He wrote, "I arrived from Tokyo. You see in what an outfit." Next. In 1912, Picasso fled Montmartre with his new love, Eva Guel, and settled in Montparnasse. At the same period, many of the younger French cubists moved to studios in Montparnasse or nearby areas of the left bank. They met frequently at the Closerie de Lila and at each other's homes, in particular at Henri Le Fauconnier's studio, Henri Visconti. A separate group of Cubist artists, most of them foreigners, developed at 26 Rue du Pas. Piet Mondrian moved into a studio there in the summer of 1912, given to him by Conrad Kickert, a fellow Dutch painter and collector. His neighbors were Dutch painter Lodewijk Schelfoet and Diego Rivera. Here Mondrian stands to the left with Schelfoet, whose painting Les Angles is on the easel. Rivera, who was working towards a Cubist style, recalled that he visited Mondrian's studio often and shared ideas with him. On the right slide, Rivera is at the far left at the costume ball, surrounded by 5 women. Next slide. This map shows somehow where the artist lived between 1913 and 1916. I estimate that about 1,500 artists lived in the area of the slide. Now you can read the name, I hope, of the people who were there. Picasso, of course, was on Boulevard Raspail and Michel Cher, Severini. Modigliani lived on Boulevard Raspail. The black, that's the Dome, the Rotonde, the Rosalie, Closerie de Lila, and the dance hall Balbelier. And on Rue Rosespara was Kiesling and Paskin, Chana Orlov, and Sadkin, Beatrice Hastings, who was Modigliani's lover, Lindenbaum, Brancusi, Rivera, and Mondrian. At the 3 Campagne premiere was the artist's favorite eating place, chez Rosalie. It was started in 1905 by Rosalie Tobbia, a former Italian model. There were 4 marble-top tables, cane-bottom chairs, a bar, and behind it a small kitchen that opened onto a large courtyard. For the next 20 years, Rosalie fed her artists hearty Italian meals. She readily gave them credit and sometimes tacked their drawings on the wall as payment. Here she stands with her son in front of the cremerie in the mid-20s. Next slide. When the war broke out in August 1940, many French artists were mobilized and foreign artists rushed to fight for France. Kiesling, shown here on the left, joined the Foreign Legion. He was wounded in 1915 in the same battle as Braque and was soon demobilized. Per Krogh joined the Norwegian Ski Ambulance Corps that served in the Vosges Mountains in the winter of 1915 to 16. Per is the second from the right wearing a helmet. Next slide. Hard times descending on those artists like Soutine, Picasso, Modigliani, and Rivera who remained in the Montparnasse. The market for artists appeared and shortages of food and coal became common. But World War I forged a sense of community in Montparnasse and the artists rallied to help each other. Marie Vassiliev opened a canteen in her studio where a full 3-course meal cost 65 centimes. Wine was 10 centimes extra. The Swedish artist Arvid Fogstedt documented life in Montparnasse during the war years. On the left, he depicts a typical evening at Vassiliev's canteen in 1915. The people here are, this is supposed to be Modigliani, and Zadkind with a pipe. And in the back is Hans Arp and his wife, Ortiz de Sarat. The canteen became very popular because it could serve liquor and stay open after all the cafes had to close at 10 o'clock. The drawing to the right is by Marie Vassiliev herself of a banquet she gave in January 1917 to celebrate Braque's return from the front. Going around the table from left, Vassiliev with a carving knife, Matisse with a turkey, Bless and Jars, who had lost his right arm in the war, Picasso, Braque's wife wearing a laurel wreath, Walter Halvorsen with his arm in the air, Léger wearing a cap, and in the upper right corner part of Marc Jacob's face. Below him, Beatrice Hastings is patting her new lover, Pina, on the behind. Next to Pina, Braque is wearing a laurel wreath. Modigliani, who crashed the party, is standing in the doorway, or in the middle of the floor. Next slide. By 1916, there was no suppressing of the energy of the artist in the midst of the hardships of the war. An intense round of artistic activity began. These slides are Fogstedt's drawing of the opening of the Lyre Palette, which included paintings by Picasso, Matisse, Modigliani, Kiesling, and Ortiz de Sarat, as well as primitive African sculpture. It was the first of a series of exhibitions held in the studio of the Swiss artist Émile Lejeune on Rue Gens. He had been sponsoring concerts and poetry readings there for about a year. In the left slide, the group is standing around Eric Satie at the piano. Among the paintings on the wall, we can identify Matisse's Still Life with Bowl and Lemon, which is now at Risti. In the right slide, we see Picasso and Chilean artist Ortiz de Serrat seated in the back talking to Kiesling and his future wife, René Gross. Next slide. Incredible as it may sound, Picasso spent a lot of time at the Rotonde during the first years of the war. Here Jacques Cousteau, in a remarkable group of photographs, documented the group who gathered for lunch on August 12, 1916. To the left, in the left slide, Ortiz de Serrat, Kiesling, Marc Jacob, Picasso, and his current mistress, Paqueret, a model for the designer Paul Poiret. They stand on the corner of Boulevard de Montparnasse outside the Rotonde at 2:15 in the afternoon. I found that out by measuring the shadows on the yeah. To the right, Modigliani and the writer André Salmon in a lively discussion about 3:30 p.m. in the same area. This is one of the two known photographs of Modigliani and Picasso together. Next. Here are two more photographs in the same series taken that day. Kiesling and Picasso stand next to a vegetable seller's cart. The last photo of the day was taken outside the post office building at about 4:30. Modigliani stands to the left smoking a cigarette, while Marc Jacob reads a book and Salmon and Ortiz look on. Next slide. Fujita soon became a well-known figure in Montparnasse with his little moustache, fringe haircut, and round glasses. He fell in love with and married the artist Fernand Barret, who, as Kiki described her, smiles and bustles around, makes more noise and commotion by herself than a banquet with 110 plates. Next slide. In 1970, Modigliani fell in love with a young art student, Jeannie Bertin, who defied her disapproving family and went to live with him. She stands on the right wearing an outfit of her own design, and in the background are some of her fashion drawings. Next. Modigliani and Jeanne moved into this studio on the top floor of an artist studio building in the courtyard of 8 Rue de la Grande Chaumière. Reached by a precarious spiral staircase, it consisted of 2 rooms which measured only 9 feet by 30 feet together. At this time, Modigliani painted his great series of sensuous nudes. His exhibition at Galerie Berkeley in December of 1917 was closed on opening night by an angry police commissioner, offended by these nudes, who, as he put it, had hair. Modigliani never had another one-person exhibition in his life. In other words, he didn't have one at all. Next slide. In January 1920, Modigliani, who had always been in poor health, became seriously ill. His friend Ortiz de Serrat found him and Jean huddled together in their bed in the freezing studio. He was taken to Hospice La Charité on Rue Jacob and died on January 24 at 8:45 in the evening. The plaster death mask of Modigliani was made by Kiesling, who also organized the funeral at Père Lachaise Cemetery. Jeanne, in the 9th month of her pregnancy, went home with her father. At 3 o'clock in the morning, she threw herself out of the 5th floor bedroom window of this building on Rue Amiot. Her family refused to accept the body, and the workmen took it in a wheelbarrow to the studio on Rue de la Grande Chaumière. Jeanne was buried the same day as Modigliani, but in a different cemetery, as her family demanded. Next slide. France quickly left the war behind. Artists from all over the world began to stream into Montparnasse, and the cafe terraces filled again. On the left is the Rotonde, which Libyan had been compelled to sell because he had let politically suspect anarchists enjoy his cafe during the war. To the right is a small cafe, Montparnasse, next door to the Rotonde, which was absorbed by the Rotonde in 1924. In this photo from July 1921, far right is the English artist Nina Hamnet with her lover, Polish artist Salvador. Sitting over in the corner here. And this is Kiki, the first photograph we found of Kiki. Next. Kiki was born Alice Prin in Châtillon-sur-Seine in Burgundy in 1901. Her unmarried mother had been forced to leave for Paris soon after Kiki was born, and Kiki was brought up by her grandmother, who earned her living by doing laundry. She was a good student, but she preferred to roam the woods and fields around Châtillon, and had to spend many hours standing behind the blackboard as punishment. This is Kiki's painting, a childhood memory. When she was 12, her mother brought her to school in Paris. From the age of 13, she had a succession of grueling, underpaid jobs. She barely managed to avoid becoming a prostitute, which was the common fate of young single girls from the lower working classes. Kiki gravitated to the artist community in Montparnasse and began to pose for some of the younger painters and sculptors. Through a friendship with Soutine, Kiki met and fell in love with the Polish artist Maurice Miczinski. To the left is a painting of her by Miczinski from 1919. Next slide. Kiki began to pose for Kiesling and other artists in Montparnasse. When she posed for Fujita the first time, he remembers that Kiki arrived completely nude under her coat. She took over his place at the easel and made a portrait of him. She then went to the cafe terrace and sold it to Henri Pierre Rocher. Fujita's nude of Kiki in the right slide was shown at the Salon d'Automne in 1922. It was sold immediately for 8,000 francs and made him famous. Next time. Man Ray grew up in Brooklyn, where he turned his bedroom into a studio. He arrived in Paris on July 22, 1921, and moved into the maid's room of an apartment where Marcel Duchamp was staying on Rue La Condamine. He was immediately accepted by the Paris Daughters group, which included André Breton, Louise Aragon, Philippe Soupeau, and Tristan Sarrat. He made this Dada photo called Suicide by superimposing on Tristan Sarrat the draped nude of Madeleine Turbon. The wallpaper behind her is the same as in the other photos Man Ray made on La Condamine, which dates the photo to 1921. I don't know if you can see the wallpaper. Next slide. Kiki has the same wallpaper behind her there. Man Ray felt the lure of the lively cafes in Montparnasse, where, as he said, people spoke French as badly as I did. He spotted Kiki sitting at the door. When he asked her to pose for him, she hesitated, saying that photographs were too realistic and could be pornographic. She finally agreed, and at the second session they fell into each other's arms and began a celebrated love affair that lasted 9 years. Again, we know from the wallpaper, as I said, behind Kiki, that the photo was taken in Man Ray's room on Rue La Condamine, and that they met before Man Ray moved to Montparnasse in December 1921. Next slide. Man Ray moved into the elegant artist studio building at 31 bis Rue Campagne Premiere, shown here on the left slide. On the right, Man Ray stands in his studio, where he began to photograph people like Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, Henri Matisse. On the wall behind him are paintings he brought from New York. Next slide. Here Brancusi is playing golf at Fontainebleau in September 1923. He was introduced to the game by his American collector John Quinn, who gave him a set of golf clubs. Brancusi became a golf addict and used to practice long drives inside his little studio at Den Passeronsen. He loved to invite people to his studio, where he cooked heavy dinners and served a lot of wine. On the right slide, he pours wine as Marcel Duchamp proposes a toast. Next slide. The American collector Alfred Barnes arrived in Paris at the end of December 1922 to enlarge his collection. The story of Barnes' discovery, quote-unquote, of Soutine during this trip grew to mythic proportions almost as soon as it happened. Barnes saw Soutine's The Pastry Cook at Paul Guillaume's gallery. He bought it and immediately wanted more works by the artist. Guillaume took him to Leopold Swarovski, who had a large number of paintings by Soutine. Barnes bought all of them and paid, it is said, $3,000 for everything. As this news spread, Soutine's work attracted other collectors and his financial success was assured. Soutine, of course, had lived extraordinarily poorly until that point. To the right, Soutine and Swarovski photographed on vacation in Vittel in the mid-20s, when both had become quite prosperous. Next slide. One day, a young girl, Lucy Badu, showed up at the Rotonde, spotted Fujita across the crowded cafe, and it was love at first sight, coup de foudre. After an adventurous search for his studio, she found him, and they disappeared into the Montparnasse hotel for 3 days, where Fujita christened her Yuki, Japanese for snow. Meanwhile, Fernand Barret looked for him in police stations and morgues all over Paris. On the left, an intimate photo of Yuki, and on the right, Fujita's painting, Yuki, Goddess of Snow. Next slide. As Fujita grew more and more successful, he and Yuki moved into a large modern house at 3 Square Montsouris at the southern edge of Paris, where they were neighbors of Braque and Derain. In the left slide, Fujita looks out of the window of the second floor. For Yuki's 21st birthday, Fujita gave her a large custom-built touring car, complete with a basque chauffeur and a hood ornament, a bronze miniature of Rodin's sculpture, Man with a Broken Nose. Next slide. In the 1920s, Pasquin and Hermine, now married, returned from 6 years in the United States. When Pasquin went to his old Montparnasse studio at 3 Rue Joseph Barra to retrieve some drawings, he ran into Lucy Krog and her son Guy coming back from a walk in the Luxembourg Gardens. He fell desperately in love with Lucy and pursued her until she was drawn into a secret love affair with him. These photos show the two families together on an outing to Robinson, just outside Paris in 1921. On the left slides are Lucy, Pasquin, Guy, and Hermine David, that is, with a donkey that could be rented for the day. To the right, Pasquin, Père, and Guy at lunch in one of the famous Robinson outdoor restaurants. Next slide. Pasquin didn't settle in Montparnasse, but took a studio on the top floor of a building to the left on Boulevard de Clichy in Montmartre, where he stayed throughout the 20s. For special occasions, Pasquin gave parties at his studio, lavish with food and drink. On the right, he invites Man Ray and Kiki to a party to celebrate July 14 in 1923. When Puskin was in the United States, he became an American citizen. Next slide. Therese Moore, who was a gymnastics instructor, came to Montparnasse. Oh, by the way, that's why he specifically says that his name was pronounced Paskin and not Pascan. Therese Moore was a gymnastic instructor who came there in 1922. She met Kiki during the July 14th celebration that year. They became best friends, and in spite of their different temperaments, Therese was self-possessed, strict, and disciplined. The poet Robert Desnos gave her the name Therese, or 13, which she liked because it provided anonymity from her bourgeois family who lived in Paris. On the left, Kiki and Therese are part of a group posing for the official photo at the Montparnasse costume ball. They're sitting right there in the middle. During the 20s, costume balls were the rage. At the artist balls, the models' costumes, scanty to begin with, were discarded by the end of the evening. The slide on the right is from a ball at the Scandinavian Art Center Maison Latour in 1924. Among some of the people, it's Kiesling is sitting there. It's supposed to be a madam of the whorehouse. Marie Vassiliev is here, and that's Jean Berlin, who was the main dancer in Ballet Suédois. And there's Stardo. That's Kiesling's wife. And the decorations were made by Paskin, Per Krog, and Nils Stardo. Next slide. In 1923, Per Krog fell in love with Therese, and as she put it, we discovered love together as if for the first time. When Per and his son Guy moved to a studio in 1924, Lucy took a small apartment across the courtyard. Lucy's love affair with Paskin was now well known. She would have dinner at Per's and put Guy to bed. Then she would leave to be with Paskin and return in the morning to send Guy off to school. On the left slide, Per in his new studio on Rival de Grasse, and on the right, one of the several portraits Per painted of Therese. Next. The first nightclub in Montparnasse, the Jockey, was opened in November 23 at the corner of Boulevard Montparnasse and Rue Campagne Première by an ex-jockey named Miller and an American artist, Hilaire Heiler, who painted the cowboys and Indians on the facade as seen in the left slide. Heiler welcomed his fellow Montparnasse artists at the Jockey, and they would perform for each other. Kiki began to sing dirty songs in her deadpan, innocent style. She was an instant hit. On the right, Kiki photographed by Man Ray, as she must have looked performing at the Jockey. Therese had made her layers of full loose underskirts that Kiki would pull up far enough to reveal that she was wearing nothing underneath. Next slide. A New York Times photographer took this photo in the front of the Jockey shortly before it opened. Kiki, Man Ray with his, as he called it, my silly Kodak. So there's Kiki, and that's Man Ray, and that's Mina Loy, the poet, Tristan Tzara, Jacques Cousteau, and Ezra Pound, and Heiler and Miller on the back there. And on the right is the nighttime crowd at the Jockey. Next slide. 1924 was a year of incredible artistic activity in Montparnasse. During 24, Man Ray made his famous surrealist image of Kiki Violon-d'Ingres, which was published in Breton's magazine Littérature in June. Kiki was also one of the recurring images in Fernand Léger's film Ballet Mécanique. This fragmented image was created using a vortoscope devised by a Rapin from his old shaving mirror. Next slide. Léger also used these close-up images of Kiki's profile and eye throughout the film. Next slide. As the 20s went on, more and more American and English tourists came to Montparnasse. Some stayed on for years. One of their favorite hangouts was a small bar called the Dingo on Rue de Londres. According to his most famous barman, Jimmy Charters, Flossie Martin, an American dancer who never left Paris, discovered the Dingo and brought all her friends there, so that there was never a table free at drinking hours. Here Flossie stands on Rue de Londres, with the awning of the Dingo behind her to the left. It was Flossie, too, who witnessed two elegantly dressed American ladies emerging from a taxi just as someone was being thrown out of the Dingo. They turned to each other in fear and anticipation and exclaimed, "This must be the place." Next slide. Outside the Dingo in 1925, second from the left is the owner Lou Wilson, and next to him in the middle is Jimmy Charters, who used to swap boxing stories with Hemingway at the Dingo. Seated left is Lady Duff Twiston, Hemingway's model for Brett Ashley in The Sun Also Rises. To the right is Kiki with a sailor friend. Jimmy wrote, "I do not suppose there is a single sailor on USS Pittsburgh who has not toasted Kiki." The other obligatory stop for Americans in Montparnasse was the bookshop Shakespeare and Company, run by Sylvia Beach, who once told Jimmy Charters, we have always served the same clients, you, Jimmy, with drinks, and I with books." Here she stands in front of her bookshop. Thornton Wilder is to the left. Kiki and Man Ray would go on vacation next slide, please. Together. And on the left, they clown around as Man Ray plays client or pimp to Kiki's prostitute during the trip south. To the right, the joyous Kiki greets the sun. Next slide. Paskin also liked to travel south and often leaving on the spur of the moment, as he did in March 1925, when Herbert Lespinasse, another American painter, invited him to his villa in Saint-Tropez. On the left, Lucy, hunting for crabs, has fallen into the water, her perpetual cigarette still in her mouth. On the right, Paskin looks out over the bay of Canibière. Next slide. Kiesling, his wife Renée, and their sons Guy and Jean in the garden of the house they rented in Saint-Mary-sur-Mer. Kiesling was increasingly in demand for his luscious nudes. Here he poses the model. Next slide. Soutine and Paulette Jourdan stand outside the farmhouse in the Blanc. The dog's name is Riquette, in case anybody's interested. The ground floor of the two-story house was used by farmers to kill their animals, and Soutine painted a series of hanging chicken carcasses there. Same year, 1925, Soutine painted his famous series of carcasses of beef on Rue Saint-Gothard in Paris. When the neighbors complained about the smell, the health authorities came to take away the rotting side of the beef. Paulette managed to convince them that it was necessary for his art. She told me this herself. They shot the side of beef full of formaldehyde, and Paulette splashed it with fresh blood as Soutine continued to paint. He was an extraordinarily slow painter. Next slide. The leader of the Surrealist poets and painters, André Breton, had briefly lived in Montparnasse at Hôtel des Écoles on Rue de Londres. But once he set up his headquarters at Place Blanche near Rue Fontaine in Montmartre, he was disdainful of Montparnasse. However, many of the members of his group remained there. The large, deep lot at 45 Rue Blomet had been a vegetable garden, but by the 1920s was overgrown with lilac trees and wild vegetation. Juan Miró and André Masson made their studios in two run-down buildings there in 1922. Here Miró finished his large painting, The Farm, which was bought by Ernest Hemingway. On the left, Miró, as photographed by Man Ray. In 1926, a new generation of surrealist artists filled Rue Blomet. Robert Desnos, his sculptor friend André de la Rivière, and Georges Malkin. Desnos was a star in the surrealist movement because he could sink into a hypnotic trance at will and compose poetry or give cryptic answers to questions from onlookers. Breton organized performances for him. Here Desnos is photographed in one of his trances. Next slide. The Surrealist group decided to open its own gallery, Galerie Surrealiste, on Rue Jacques Cousteau. Man Ray was invited to have the inaugural show in March 1926. Man Ray wrote that he showed mostly pieces from his Dada period, which fitted in just fine with the Surrealist idea. Primitive art from the collection of Roland Tuel, Breton, and others were shown at the same time as Man Ray's work. This photo Man Ray made of Kiki was of a Baule mask from the Ivory Coast, was taken in 1926. It may have been for the cover of his exhibition announcement. He actually used a photo of an oceanic figure from the island of Nias. And this photo of Kiki was never published until the 70s. This is the uncropped version of the photo. Next slide. During the 20s, Kiki painted seriously and had an exhibition at Galerie du Sacre du Printemps, shown here in a photo by André Cartier. The gallery was run by a Polish musician, Jan Sliwinski, who showed a wide variety of artists. André Cartier had an exhibition just before Kiki and Bernice Abbott just after her. The Paris Tribune reported that Kiki's opening on March 25, 1927 was, quote, the most successful vernissage of the year. And from 5 o'clock to after midnight, the habitués of the quarter came in a steady stream, and the little gallery seized with excited comments. Cartier took his photo of Kiki in the gallery with the paintings on the wall behind her. Next slide. The terraces of the cafes in Montparnasse in the late 20s were full day and night. I calculated that steamships from the United States unloaded more than 5,000 tourists a week who immediately headed for Montparnasse. In 1926, René Lafont and Ernst Froh bought an old lumber and coal yard on Boulevard de Montparnasse just down from the Dome and built a large restaurant, La Coupole. It opened with a huge inaugural party on December 20, 1927, and was an instant success. The artist gravitated to the bar, whose entrance is at the left of the terrace in the slide, presided over by the barman, Bob Ludwig. The Kupol bar became the jumping off place where everyone met for a drink before starting out for the night, and where they came back for the last drink before going home in the early hours of the morning. Next slide. The young women who left their families to live a free, independent life in Montparnasse gave a source of energy and erotic excitement to life there. On the left are Mary Oppenheim and Irene Zürkinden, both from Switzerland. Oppenheim became part of the Surrealist group, and Zürkinden was attracted to the Paris of Toulouse-Lautrec. Whenever she sold a painting, she would rent a horse and carriage for a ride around Paris. On the right is Man Ray's portrait of Jacqueline Barsotti. Tall, blonde, and very beautiful, she would pose for artists during the day, and then was a non-stop participant in the heavy nightlife. She just celebrated her 80th birthday on the Isle of Wight. Next slide. Alexander Calder arrived in Paris in June 1926 and soon began to give performances of his circus, photographed on the left by André Cartier. He always served salted peanuts and nothing to drink during the performance. A thirsty guest made for the neighborhood bar as soon as he finished. On the right is one of the sculptures of Kiki, whose nose, Calder said, seemed to jut out into space. Next. Paskin was constantly looking for models of the type he liked, young and sensuous, like Paquita and Césarine in the slide to the left. They relaxed in the gray slips that Lucy made for them to pose in. When not painting, Paskin loved to have people around him. Every Saturday night, he would invite 20 to 30 people to dinner in a restaurant near his Montmartre studio. The babble of many languages would be broken by impromptu singing and the young models dancing nude on the tables. The group would continue on an all-night rounds of boîtes and brothels. On the left, painter Charlotte Gardel, Hermine David with her dog, and Claudia Loiseau. Next. In 1928, a young journalist and caricaturist from Bordeaux, Henri Broca, came to Montparnasse. He fell in love with Montparnasse and with Kiki. He started a magazine called Paris Montparnasse, which glorified the stars and the golden days of Montparnasse, and also promoted the freneticized, tourist-fed cafe life of Montparnasse in the late 20s. In the French tradition of banquets, Broca launched a series of Paris Montparnasse dinners hosted by local celebrities. On the left is the dinner held May 3rd, 1929, at the newly opened Normandy, hosted by Kiki, who is sitting in the back with Fujita. And there's Broca, Therese, Lucy, Hermine David, and there's Zina, a model who is also very well today. Broca also organized a matinee benefit performance at the Bobino Theater on Rue de la Gaîté to raise money for poor artists. The flyer on the left features Fujita, Marie Vasilev, and Kiki, and promised the election of the Queen of Montparnasse. You can guess who won. Broca's enthusiasm for Kiki was, next slide please. His enthusiasm for Kiki was boundless. He published her memoirs in 1929. On the cover is a painting of Kiki by Kiesling. Edward Titus, the husband of Helena Rubinstein, had a small exclusive bookshop on Rue de l'Ambre. He had just published Lady Chatterley's Lover and decided to publish the English version of Kiki's memoirs. Titus asked Hemingway to write the introduction, and as a favor to Kiki, he agreed. Hemingway then proceeded to create a storm of controversy among the translator and the publisher when he declared it is a crime to translate Kiki. Next slide. American artists who arrived in the late 20s found the atmosphere more frantic, but still seduced and sustained by Montparnasse. Stuart Davis arrived in Paris in 1928 and moved into a studio in an impasse on Rue Vercingetorix. Isamu Noguchi became part of the group on Rue Vercingetorix when he arrived in Paris in 1927 on a Guggenheim. Through the writer Robert McCalman, he met Brancusi and studied with him briefly. Here Noguchi sits in his studio, which he wanted to look like Brancusi's, where everything was all white. Next. Elements of upheaval and tragedy began to creep into the artists' lives. In Deauville, Fujita agreed to make publicity for the casino, thus launching the idea of artists as media star. Here on the beach, he takes notes about the singer Susie Solidor. A gossip column falsely reported that Fujita had gambled away millions at the tables in Deauville. This led to a tax investigation and a large bill from the authorities. He and Yuki fled briefly to Japan, where they sold paintings to raise the money. But their marriage did not survive. Fujita fell in love with the singer Marie Lequeux, and they left for South America and Japan. Next slide. Yuki took solace with Robert Desnos, who had been in love with her for several years. Here they sit to the right, to the left, at one of Pasquin's Saturday night dinners. The frantic nightlife in Montparnasse continued, crowded around the Desnos and Yuki. Desnos and Yuki. Crowded around the bar at the Capole are Herminda David, Charlotte Gardel, Maria Lidis, Fujita, Kiesling, Brocca, and Jacqueline. You can see her face top there. Next. Pasquin's relationship with Lucy became more and more difficult, and he was increasingly dissatisfied with his eroticized paintings of what he called his little women. Noguchi remembers one night in late May 1930 that Pasquin came into the Capole bar and insisted on settling all his bills with Bob the barman. Then on June 1st, just after the opening of his one-man exhibition, Pasquin disappeared. 3 days later, Lucy went with a locksmith to his studio at Boulevard de Clichy. He was found hanging from a doorknob. He had first cut his wrist and written in blood on the door, "Adieu, Lucy." Shocked and grieving, his friends put flowers around his body, lying on a mattress on the floor in his studio. Next slide. In 1929, Man Ray met the young, beautiful Lee Miller, who had been the leading model in New York and came to Paris to become a photographer. They fell in love and lived together for more than 3 years. On the left, a Man Ray photo of Lee, and on the right, his self-portrait. Next slide. At the time of the crash, Kiki began to sing full-time in boîtes and cabarets to support herself. A few years later, she met André Larocque, who soon quit his job as tax collector to accompany her on the accordion. The photo is by Brassai. With the stock market crash, the terraces of the cafes seemed to empty overnight. Montparnasse still existed as an artist community until the middle 50s. But in the period I just described, it had been the embodiment of outspokenness, audacity, and creativity, which, as one French writer has said, was without peer or parallel, a moment in time forever lost, but never forgotten. Thank you.